The Senate chamber was thick with tension that morning. Cameras flashed, pens scribbled, eyes narrowed, and yet, amidst the murmur of suits and sanitized diplomacy, it only took one voice, sharp, southern, and condescending, to rupture the calm. J.D. Vance rose from his seat with the deliberate pomp of a man who believed the room belonged to him. "With all due respect," he said, gesturing toward the African delegation, "some people here simply do not belong." A few senators shifted in their chairs, unsure if they had misheard. But Vance clarified, his voice gaining venom, "This chamber is for global leaders, not for militants dressed as diplomats." The insult was naked, the implication clear, and at the center of it stood Ibrahim Traoré. Wearing his iconic beret and calm as ever, Traoré didn't blink. He leaned forward with the weight of generations in his stare. There was no rush in his breath, no twitch in his hand, only a stillness so powerful it swallowed the room. When he stood, silence followed, no translation needed, no aid at his side. Just the man, the fire, and the reckoning. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "You call me a threat," Traoré began, locking eyes with Vance. "But it's not because I don't belong here. It's because you're afraid I do." Murmurs rippled, cameras turned. The senators who had looked away now stared, transfixed. "Afraid," Traoré continued, "of a voice you can't buy. A continent you can't silence. A future you can't control." The moment was molten. The air heavy, and for once, J.D. Vance, usually loud, usually smug, had no words. Only a clenched jaw and reddening ears. Outside, social feeds exploded. Inside, history shifted. Traoré hadn't just entered the room. He had claimed the confrontation echoed far beyond Capitol Hill. Within hours, Traoré's words were trending globally. Clips of him saying, "You fear me because I belong," were being replayed on every platform, uncut, unfiltered, undeniable. But behind the viral storm, a deeper tremor began to shake the establishment. Vance, humiliated on live television, retreated behind a wall of aides and advisors. What was meant to be a symbolic dismissal had backfired. Instead of silencing Traoré, he had amplified him. And Traoré? He didn't gloat. He didn't post a victory statement. He simply moved with precision, meeting with youth leaders, environmental activists, and lawmakers from the global south. His presence was not just symbolic, it was strategic. In one private roundtable, a young senator from Brazil leaned in and whispered, "They've never been challenged like that before." Traoré smiled faintly. "They've never seen Africa unafraid," he replied. Meanwhile, inside conservative circles, panic swelled. Vance's donors were furious. Some called for a public apology. Others suggested doubling down with tougher rhetoric. But none of them could erase the image, an American senator flustered, and an African revolutionary unshaken. Back in Ohio, Vance attempted damage control. He appeared on a late-night political show, trying to recast the moment as a misunderstanding. The host raised an eyebrow. "A misunderstanding that went viral in 40 languages?" Vance laughed nervously. "I meant to defend tradition." And instead, the host replied, "You made Traoré a legend." That word, legend, spread like wildfire. It wasn't part of Traoré's plan, but it became the narrative. Headlines across Africa read, "He walked into their house, and took their mic." And in Washington, those who once laughed at the name Traoré now said it with caution. Because the game had changed. And so had the players. The next morning, the White House Situation Room was unusually tense. Not because of a missile threat or an economic crash, no, this time, the fear came from a name echoing through every corridor of global diplomacy: Ibrahim Traoré. President Trump's advisors were split. Some urged him to ignore the rising media storm. "Don't legitimize him by responding," one said. But others weren't so sure. "Sir, he's not just going viral. He's becoming the face of something bigger, something we don't control." Trump, pacing, finally muttered, "Then it's time we remind the world who leads." But by then, Traoré had already moved 3 steps ahead. In a packed auditorium at Georgetown University, he gave a speech that didn't just clap back, it shook the foundations of Western narrative. Standing tall under the harsh lights, with every camera locked in, he began. I was told I didn't belong. But let me be clear, I don't belong to your systems. I don't belong to your hierarchy. I belong to something older than this republic and more sacred than your borders. I belong to a people who remember, a people you tried to erase. The audience, a mix of stunned scholars and fired-up students, erupted. He spoke of centuries of extraction masked as aid, of coups funded in silence, of leaders murdered for daring to dream outside Western control. And then he turned the room cold. And now, when Africa speaks for itself, you tremble. That clip alone garnered 80 million views in 24 hours. Fox News called him a threat to stability. CNN called him the voice of a rising continent. But the youth across the world? They called him the man who speaks what no one dares. Back in the Senate, J.D. Vance watched the headlines roll in. Traoré dismantles the empire, with words. One aide hesitated before speaking. Senator, maybe this isn't over. He didn't respond. Just stared at the screen, as Traoré's final words from the speech replayed again and again. I didn't come here to take a seat. I came to flip the walls of Capitol Hill had witnessed countless speeches. Yet none had spread like wildfire the way Traoré's had. By dawn, even conservative media couldn't ignore the tidal wave. Inside a Pentagon briefing room, military officials whispered about him. Not as a politician, but as a psychological disruptor. He's not a general, but he fights with ideas. Not a president in our pocket. That's the problem. At the UN, silence fell when Traoré entered the chamber. Delegates who once dismissed Africa's voice now leaned in, afraid to blink. And just when the usual agenda began, Traoré raised his placard. He didn't wait to be recognized. He stood, straightened his jacket, and without a script, said, when your tanks rolled into our streets, you called it order. When our people resist, you call it chaos. But order built on injustice is nothing but a slow war. J.D. Vance, who happened to be seated 2 rows back, snorted, loud enough for the mic to pick it up. Cameras shifted. All eyes turned. Traoré paused, looked over his shoulder, and locked eyes with Vance. You called me a stranger in this hall. But I've walked on lands where your flag flies and your bombs fell. If presence earns belonging, then I belong more than you. Whispers turned into stunned silence. Vance's face flushed. A delegate from South America clapped, once. Then another. Then the room broke into full applause. Outside, protesters holding "Africa will rise" banners cheered as news outlets flooded social media with a single caption. Traoré turns the UN into a courtroom, and the West is on trial. Back in Washington, Vance met with aides. He humiliated you, one finally admitted. Not for long, Vance replied, coldly. Next time, I'll answer, and I won't be polite. But politeness was never Traoré's concern. Truth was, the next morning, a storm was already brewing, not in the sky, but in the press rooms and encrypted chats of Western intelligence. Traoré's speech had been clipped, translated, and uploaded over 50 million times. Even TikTok was flooded with young Americans lip-syncing his words. Order built on injustice is nothing but a slow war. J.D. Vance was livid. He went live on Fox Prime, trying to reclaim control. This isn't just about diplomacy anymore, he growled. We are witnessing a coordinated assault on Western authority, and it's coming from the mouth of a man who, let's be honest, wasn't even invited into global leadership. He barged in. But the damage was already done. Vance's words sounded defensive, brittle, as if trying to patch a dam already cracked. Traoré, meanwhile, didn't bother replying. He didn't have to. The next day, he appeared at Howard University, standing before thousands of Black American students who saw in him something they hadn't seen in D.C. for years, defiant dignity. They fear us not because we are weak, Traoré told the crowd, but because they know what will happen if we ever believe in our power. Chants erupted. Rise, Africa. Rise, truth. We see you, Traoré. But it wasn't just African descendants who listened. Even white American youth, those disillusioned by endless wars and political theater, posted his quotes with captions like, "Say it louder." Finally, someone said it. In private, Vance's team scrambled. They drafted counter-narratives, ordered background checks, leaked smear campaigns. But nothing stuck. "He's clean," one staffer whispered. "No," said Vance, his jaw tight. "He's dangerous." Then he looked at the camera, recording his next message, a direct one. This time, no studio, no anchor, just him, staring straight into the lens. "Ibrahim Traoré, you've had your moment. But you're not untouchable, and you're not American. Remember that." He hit post. Within seconds, Traoré's reply was trending worldwide. It was a video of him at the UN, from earlier. Captioned only, "Not American, but still, you tremble." The Senate floor was thick with tension, each word exchanged like a loaded round fired across centuries of injustice. J.D. Vance, desperate to reclaim the room he had lost, began raising his voice, invoking order, law, and American values. But the louder he shouted, the more the room seemed to lean toward Traoré, drawn not just to what he said, but how he stood. Traoré waited patiently. Then, with the calm of a man who had seen far more chaos than Capitol Hill could ever offer, he stepped forward again. Cameras clicked. A hush fell. "You quote order like it was born here," Traoré said slowly, "but your order was built on slavery. Your values, on blood. And now you ask me to apologize for reminding you?" A ripple of discomfort ran through the American delegation. Someone from the press pool gasped audibly. Vance took a half-step back. "You don't fear me because I'm wrong," Traoré continued. "You fear me because deep down, you know I'm right. And worse, you know I'm not alone anymore." He turned slightly to nod toward the back rows, where representatives from Mali, Burkina Faso, South Africa, even Brazil, sat nodding. A new bloc, silent until now, stood aligned, not behind Traoré, but with him. It wasn't about charisma anymore. It was about gravity. Vance tried to interrupt, but even his voice couldn't cut through the shift in atmosphere. For the first time, the chamber didn't recognize his authority, not because it was challenged, but because it no longer mattered. Traoré's presence wasn't just powerful. It was tectonic. Vance, cornered by the silence of the room and the roar in Traoré's voice, attempted one last rhetorical defense. "This is our house," he spat. "You're just a guest here." Traoré didn't flinch. "A guest?" he echoed, his voice cool but edged with iron. "You burn the world, steal the gold, the oil, the land, and then call us guests when we arrive at the table you built from our bones?" The chamber reeled. Even some of Vance's allies glanced away, unable to meet Traoré's gaze. He stepped forward, slowly now, deliberate, as if every step echoed centuries of resistance. "I did not come here to beg," he said. "I came here to warn you." He paused, then turned, addressing not just Vance, but the entire hall. "You call for peace only when the fire reaches your door. But when Gaza burned, when Africa bled, when Haiti starved, you were quiet. Now, your silence will not save you." Cameras zoomed in. Phones vibrated across the world as live translations of his words flooded social media. "We will not be quiet," Traoré declared. "We will not bow. If you fear our voice, it's because it speaks the truth you've buried for generations." Then he did something no one expected. He raised his fist. Not in threat, but in solidarity. "Silence is over. The global south is awake. And we do not fear empires built on lies." Vance sat down, unable to meet his eye. The illusion of dominance had cracked. And Traoré, still calm, still defiant, had shifted the world one sentence at a time. The room had grown quieter, not with peace, but with pressure. As if every wall was leaning inward, listening. Vance stayed silent now, his confidence shattered. Yet from across the floor, a new voice rose, Senator Caldwell, trying to reclaim control. "We're not here to argue history," she said coldly. We're here to restore order. Traoré turned toward her slowly. Order, he repeated, as if tasting the word for the first time. Is that what you call bombing hospitals, starving children, looting nations through suits instead of guns? Caldwell stiffened. You're crossing a line. No, Traoré said. I'm erasing one. He stepped forward again, not toward her, but toward the center of the chamber, the spot reserved for declarations, legislation, and legacy. Every leader present instinctively leaned in. You demand order, he said. Yet you create chaos wherever your flags land. You destabilized Libya. You armed dictators in the Sahel. You turned Palestine into a cage. And when those you wounded demand justice, you accuse them of being threats. His voice didn't rise. He didn't need to yell. The weight of his words landed heavier than any shout. I am not the threat, he continued. Your arrogance is. Your denial is. Your refusal to face what you've done to the world is. Traoré turned in a slow circle, addressing every power block represented. You fear disorder, but only when you are not the ones giving orders. A hush followed. Not out of reverence, but realization. Traoré wasn't just confronting an empire, he was dismantling the myth it had built around itself. Then, calmly, he walked back to his seat. The silence that followed was no longer American. It was global. The silence cracked, subtly, but unmistakably, when Traoré took his seat. He hadn't just spoken. He'd shifted the axis. One by one, ambassadors and officials exchanged nervous glances, like men who had just realized the foundation beneath them was not as unshakable as they believed. Then, from the American delegation, J.D. Vance leaned forward again. But this time, there was no smugness. No superiority. Only defiance masked as diplomacy. We've led the world because we had the courage to make the hard choices, he said, trying to reclaim the narrative. You talk fire, but fire burns everyone. Traoré didn't even rise this time. He just met Vance's gaze and responded from where he sat, his voice low but razor-sharp. You didn't lead with courage, he said. You ruled with fear. You turned nations into ashes to light your path, and now you tremble because that fire is no longer yours to control. He leaned forward slightly, eyes locked on Vance. You fear our rise not because we're dangerous, but because we don't need your permission. A diplomat from South America nodded. An African Union delegate whispered, say it again. The room wasn't frozen anymore, it was heating up. Traoré continued, you call it chaos when the oppressed stand. You call it instability when the stolen demand return. But we are not asking anymore. He looked toward the Eastern Bloc. Then toward the global South. You can't extinguish what's already burning. You can't lead a world that's already moving on without you. A beat passed. And then, with absolute calm, you want to lead? Then step aside. Because Africa isn't waiting. The chamber was no longer his opponent's arena. It was Traoré's stage. The air inside the chamber was electric, thick with the weight of history pressing down. No one moved. No one dared to break the moment Traoré had carved out of time itself. Cameras zoomed in, satellites locked, millions of screens flickered alive across continents. The world wasn't just watching. The world was witnessing. And J.D. Vance? He sat back in his chair, no retort left. Just a hollow stare, the kind a man gives when he realizes he's already lost, not in shouts or battles, but in hearts and minds. His silence was louder than anything he'd said. Across the hall, young diplomats stood up, some subtly, others proudly. A Ghanaian delegate wiped away a tear. A Brazilian minister tapped his mic and said, let the record show, we stand with Traoré. Applause spread like wildfire. Not loud. Not chaotic. Purposeful. Like a drumbeat from the soil of forgotten ancestors. Traoré stood once more. But this time, not to confront, only to close. Leadership, he said, is not claimed by might. It is earned by truth. And truth, no matter how dangerous, never dies quietly. He glanced at the press cameras. You've heard many voices in these halls, voices of war, of profit, of empire. But today, the world heard something else. He paused, then spoke, not just to the room, but to history. You heard Africa. And we are not done speaking. He stepped back. And for the first time in decades, the UN chamber felt like something new. Like change had entered and taken a seat that no one could take away. As Traoré walked out, the world didn't return to silence. It began to listen.